Well, thank you for this opportunity. It's so wonderful to be here. And Joe, I appreciate everything that you've done to make that happen. I traveled here tonight really to have an opportunity to hear from you, to understand what's on your mind as you think about China, where you see the U.S.-China relationship heading, what role you think China should play in our politics. But I understand that my price of admission for hearing that from you is to share a few thoughts of my own. So I will try to be deliberately efficient in sharing a few thoughts. I'm going to spend about 30 minutes situating where I see China at this moment, how I expect the United States-China relationship to develop, where I see the China-Russia relationship heading, and also what's happening in the Taiwan Strait, which is an issue that has been getting a fair bit of attention recently. I hope that these opening comments open some useful avenues for our conversation, but I will be happy to take the discussion in any direction that you would like. And before I begin, let me just say one final thing, which is that my emotions are not attached to any of this analysis. So please feel free to interrupt, to push back, to disagree, to challenge anything I'm about to tell you. So to situate the present at a very macro level, I think that the world is undergoing one of the most significant transitions since the 1850s. The 1850s are significant because that's when power shifted across the Atlantic from Europe to the United States. The United States became the ascendant power. We may be going through a similar period now, where the distribution of power is flowing across the Pacific, increasingly residing in Asia. Asia is the new engine of the global economy. This isn't opinion, this is just an observation of observable data. Upwards of 2/3 of the world's growth economically is in Asia. The region is home to over 50% of the world's population, 60% of the world's youth, and 60% of the world's GDP. The story of development in the 21st century is going to be defined by what happens in Asia. And within Asia, China is at the center. It is the leading driver of growth. China represents around 1/3 of the global economy's growth. China's growth is slowing, but it is still growing from a very large base. China enjoys advantages that only China is able to enjoy. They have clustering effects around innovation in many of the cities along the eastern shoreline, a highly competitive market, world-class infrastructure, and 1 in every 5 human beings on Earth that they count as part of their population. And so while we talk a little bit about decoupling or separating the United States and Chinese economies, the story inside Asia is one of recoupling, of deepening integration with China at the center of it. China is central to value chains in Asia and globally. And there is some low-end manufacturing that is leaving China to go to places where it can be done more efficiently and cheaply, like Vietnam and Bangladesh, Cambodia. But a lot of the high-end assembly for electric vehicles and other equipment is done in China. Tesla's largest production facility in the world is in China. As a consequence, I think that a lot of Chinese leaders are sort of feeling their oats. They feel like their time has come, that China is now a truly global actor. They don't talk anymore about their peaceful rise or gradually reforming and opening. Now they talk about China as a model, China as a global leader, China's national rejuvenation, and the restoration of the glory of the Chinese civilization. They are undertaking major initiatives in virtually every corner of the world. And this has raised a debate inside the United States and elsewhere about what does China want to do with all of this power that it is amassing. And I think there are a spectrum of views inside the United States on this question. To some people see China as having more benign ambitions, wanting to preserve and protect the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, having a mostly inward-focused ambition. Others have a different view. They think that China wants to be the dominant actor in the world, to displace the United States, to impose its vision and its values on the world when it has the opportunity to do so. I think I probably fall somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. I think that China does desire to be the leading power in Asia. It does want to be a leading power on the world stage. It does want to have its political and economic models respected. And I think it does want to enjoy deference to what it considers to be its core interests. And this creates a natural tension between the United States and China, because we are two different countries. We do have two different governance models, two different economic models. We have different views on the distribution of power in the international system, on the role that rules or relative power should play in determining the outcomes to disputes. We have different conceptions of the roles of individual liberties versus social stability and where the balance should be. And we just have fundamentally different views on important issues such as Taiwan or Xinjiang or Tibet or Hong Kong. And as a consequence, the US-China relationship has gotten increasingly tense in recent years. From the United States perspective, at least in Washington, the view is that China's actions are driving a lot of the downward trajectory of the US-China relationship. But what I often hear when I travel to China or speak with Chinese counterparts is that the problem isn't China's actions. The problem is American anxieties, that we are anxious declining power, worried about losing our privileged position, acting anxiously to cling to what we have and to push China down from surpassing us. So we disagree on the sources of the downward trajectory in the relationship. But one thing that we do agree upon is that tensions have been rising, and that if left unchecked, this could be really dangerous for both of us. And this is what we saw when our two leaders met in Indonesia earlier this week. They didn't agree on much, but they did agree that tensions needed to be managed, that the temperature needed to be lowered, and that we can compete, but we must not have conflict with each other. They didn't do it as a favor to each other. They did it because it was in each of their own self-interest. Neither leader gave any ground on their top priorities. They didn't offer any concessions. There weren't any breakthroughs. But they both acknowledged that they need to find ways to manage this relationship so that we don't find ourselves shooting at each other. And so to try to do that, they agreed to reopen some of the channels of communication between Washington and Beijing. America's Secretary of State will travel to China early next year. And China's President Xi Jinping will travel to the United States next fall for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, which the United States will host next year. And so last week and next fall are sort of bookends to a one-year experiment to see if we can find a way to reset or reestablish a certain level of stability in the US-China relationship. But as we watch the news every day, it's hard to sort of get a sense of where we are. How close are we to the edge of a crisis or a calamity? I want to try to offer you a bit of optimism. I think that we aren't that close to the edge. And the reason I think so is that policy officials in both Washington and Beijing have a pretty high degree of confidence in their capacity to manage this relationship. They are not overly panicked or anxious. Both President Biden and President Xi are pretty confident in their capacity to deal with each other. They feel like they're capable of stepping in when they need to arrest any sharp slides in the relationship. And I thought it was interesting when President Biden spoke to the media after his meeting with President Xi. What he said he was most concerned about was not an inability to manage competing interests. It was that miscalculation could be born out of a misunderstanding, and that we need to reduce space for miscalculation in order to avoid unintended catastrophe. The other reason why I'm not losing too much sleep at night is because I don't think that either leader or either country benefits from allowing tensions to escalate uncontrollably. Both sides have pretty significant domestic challenges of their own that they're dealing with right now. Neither leader wants to be perceived as weak, but neither, I don't think, is looking for a fight with each other. And so the net outcome of all of this, I expect, and if Joe will invite me back in a year, we can test this proposition. But I expect that the trajectory of the US-China relationship that has been traveling a pretty sharply downward trajectory for a considerable number of years will flatten for the coming year. I will not anticipate, though, that it will rise. I would love for there to be an improvement in the overall relationship, but I don't know if that is possible in this current environment. In order for the relationship between the United States and China to improve, one of three things would need to happen. We would need to be able to solve an existing problem. We would need to be able to agree to prevent the emergence of a new problem, or we would need to be able to expand the agenda of the relationship to dilute the sources of tension that are embedded in the relationship. And it's going to be difficult for us to do any of those three things in the current climate and in the coming year. So this is where we are. The relationship is at sort of an uneasy equilibrium right now. There is this deep, thick economic interdependence with over $700 billion of goods and services being traded between our two countries this year. We're going to set a new record, more than any previous year in the history of the U.S.-China relationship in terms of overall bilateral trade. There is selective decoupling or separation between the U.S. and Chinese economies in technology, high-end technology equipment. And there is pretty significant geopolitical tensions. That's the backdrop of the U.S.-China relationship. And I think that the fact that both leaders agree that we need to work hard to avoid conflict provides a bit of a bulwark against a further deterioration. But unless and until the relationship finds a common purpose and a common agenda, it's going to be hard to avoid allowing the relationship to be defined by anything other than these sources of tension that exist in the relationship. And two of the largest existing or potential sources of tension are Taiwan and Russia. The China-Russia relationship has grown unnaturally and uncomfortably for us, close. I think that Beijing sees its relationship with Russia as a vehicle to its global aspirations. The two presidents, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, they got together on the margins of the Winter Olympics in February of this year in Beijing. And they signed a joint communique that set out a vision for remaking the world order to better suit their preferences. This was the product of years of building of a relationship between these two leaders. They do have, I think, a fairly genuine relationship. Putin calls Xi on his birthdays. They send letters to each other on important anniversaries. He checks in on Xi Jinping's wife and daughter. And he speaks to Xi Jinping's darkest fears. It's not lost on Xi Jinping that 41% of autocratic leaders are either killed, imprisoned, or exiled within 1 year of leaving office. This is his nightmare. When Gaddafi was killed after Libya collapsed, it was Putin that walked through in fine detail for Xi Jinping what that looked like for him. And so he speaks to Xi Jinping's darkest fears, but he also speaks to Xi Jinping's aspirations. He tells Xi Jinping that of course China and Russia should come together to dim the attraction of liberal democracy. Of course China and Russia should work together to try to loosen the U.S. alliance network. Of course both countries should work together to try to lessen the focus on individual freedoms in the international system. Of course they should strengthen control over civil society, over the internet, over the pesky independent media in both of their countries. And so he speaks to Xi's fears, he speaks to Xi's aspirations, and he presents himself as a partner in Xi's project. And I think China likes having a partner. Historically, they haven't had a lot of partners or friends over the years. And by historic standards, I think the China-Russia relationship is unnaturally close. And as long as these two leaders stay in power, I expect that it probably will remain pretty close. But I wouldn't treat it as foregone that the China-Russia relationship will remain this close forever. I think it's sort of an artificial artifact of the moment that we're in. And part of the reason why I feel that way is that I think that China feels like its future is bright. It wants to be an architect of a reimagined international system. I think Putin is more of an arsonist than an architect of the international system. And I don't think that he has confidence that Russia's future is incredibly bright. It was an inconvenient fact for Beijing that Putin decided to invade Ukraine 3 weeks after the two leaders met in Beijing and signed this joint communique. And I think the worst outcome for Beijing and Ukraine would be if Putin fails and Putin falls. Xi Jinping would lose his friend. And it's unclear whether Russia would remain hostile to the West or whether it would find virtue in reestablishing ties with Europe and the West. And if they did, that would leave China isolated and alone to confront what they perceive as a hostile West. I think China would prefer to stand back to back with Russia to deal with this hostility than to be isolated and alone to deal with it all on its own. But at the same time, I don't think that the Chinese leaders are particularly enamored to be associated with the atrocities taking place in Russia. And so we have seen subtle, small, incremental steps by Beijing to try to create a little bit of distance between themselves and Russia's actions in Ukraine. They have called the war a tragedy. They have pledged future humanitarian assistance. They have rhetorically expressed support for a ceasefire, but they're not putting any pressure on Russia to accept it. They have said that no leader should threaten or use nuclear weapons. And last week, conveniently, in the hours before President Xi and President Biden met, an unnamed Chinese official spoke to the press and said that Putin had not briefed Xi Jinping on his plans in Ukraine when they met in early February, that Xi Jinping was caught off guard by what Russia had decided to do. In other words, China should not be viewed as complicit in Russia's actions in Ukraine. And so I think these all represent cautious, incremental steps by Beijing to begin to distance itself from Moscow. I don't think that China will repudiate Russia, but they do highlight that China is not necessarily invested in Russia achieving all of its objectives in Ukraine, because China's interests are served by a functioning and strong Russia, not by a Russia that is bleeding itself out in Ukraine. And while I think Xi Jinping genuinely does have some affection for Putin, in my experience, in the 14 or 15 meetings I've been in with him, I've left with the impression that Xi Jinping is probably the most cold-blooded calculator of his own personal interests of any person I've ever met. He is not a sentimentalist. So Putin's adventure in Ukraine creates a lot of challenges for Xi. I think the best case from China's perspective would be if Putin gracefully withdrew from Ukraine and reconstituted its power at home. I'm not a Russia expert, but I don't see that happening. That doesn't seem to be reflective of Putin's personality. Grace and withdrawal don't seem to be attributes. So as Putin's position in Ukraine erodes, China's response, I think, is an important space for us to watch. But Russia's invasion of Taiwan has also created other challenges for Beijing, including over Taiwan, because it has opened the aperture on this conversation about Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. And at a superficial level, Ukraine and Taiwan do share similar attributes, the most important being that they are small democratic states coveted by large authoritarian neighbors. But beyond that, the similarities between Ukraine and Taiwan begin to break down pretty quickly. Ukraine is connected by a land border to Russia, to Poland and others. Taiwan is separated by a 100-mile moat. To put that in perspective, that's 3 times wider than the English Channel, which we can all visualize from D-Day times. Taiwan sits at the center of global value chains. It produces over 80% of the world's high-end semiconductor chips. Ukraine does not. Taiwan is a thriving democracy. Ukraine is ranked 122nd out of 180 in the list of corruption indexes by Freedom House. The United States has a Taiwan Relations Act with Taiwan that obligates by law the United States to maintain the capacity to resist the use of force against Taiwan. We have no similar arrangement or obligation to Ukraine. And Ukraine has demonstrated a certain warrior spirit. They have spent the last 6 or 7 years since Russia took over Crimea to build territorial defense forces, to develop a special operation forces capacity. Anyone who has been to Taiwan, would probably conclude that Taiwan's military is not treated with the same reverence inside Taiwan that Ukraine's forces are in Ukraine. Now, none of this changes China's appetite for absorbing Taiwan, which is longstanding and I think genuine. But it does call into question any arguments about whether there's an automaticity between what is happening in Ukraine and what will happen in Taiwan. And at least between now and 2024, I'm reasonably confident that there will not be a spark for conflict in the Taiwan Strait. President Tsai, Taiwan's president, is sort of known for being pragmatic and principled and steady and predictable. She is not going to trigger a cross-strait conflict. Joe Biden, I don't think, is looking for a fight with China over Taiwan in the coming year and a half, 2 years. And so that sort of leaves the question on China. Does China view it as being in its interest to have a war, potentially with the United States and Japan and others in the Taiwan Strait? If China decides that all other options have been exhausted and it has no other alternative other than use of force to foreclose the possibility of Taiwan independence, I think that they could decide to use force. But I don't have a sense that it is their first option or their plan at the moment. As I think back on what President Xi told his people at his party congress 2 weeks ago, he said we're winning, that time and momentum are on China's side, that China is gaining strength every year, that sooner or later the people of Taiwan will come to their senses and realize that their future lies with Beijing. And by the way, the Americans should stay out of this. That was his message. It wasn't a message that suggested, it didn't sound like something that someone would say when they were trying to prepare their population for a huge conflict. So I do not see the lights flashing red right now, but we'll have to watch that space. But at a broader level, I guess the message that I hope to leave you with is that I don't think that conflict is the plan for the United States and China. There is no precedent in human history of two countries that share our attributes ever fighting a war against each other. Two nuclear-armed powers with long-range strike capabilities, cyber capabilities, space capabilities. Countries with these attributes have never, ever before fought each other. And if they did, it would create extraordinary destruction. It would be very difficult to manage escalation. And it would be very, very difficult to imagine one country prevailing over the other. The United States and China view each themselves as singular powers. They don't accept a subordinate status to the other. And I think it would be difficult for either side to ever contemplate the idea of surrendering to the other, short of a humanity-threatening event. So what are we doing? The United States is focused on trying to deter China from acting on aggressive impulses by building up its military capabilities, tightening its alliance network around Asia. And China is also investing in its capabilities, particularly its nuclear capabilities. China is building a nuclear force at a faster rate than any other country in the world right now. But they're also pursuing a geo-economic strategy. They're not in the process of building military bases around the world in the same way that the United States has. They have one overseas military base in the world. It's a small base in Djibouti. That's it. The question, though, is whether China's military will follow its economics. And that's a question for the future that no one knows. And the history of great power competition doesn't provide much of a roadmap for us. The last two times the United States has been involved in great power competition have been World War II and the Cold War. We prevailed militarily in one instance. We benefited from the collapse of our adversary in the other. And I'm not sure that either of those options will be available to us in the case of China. I don't think that we can count on China's collapse, and I hope that we never find out whether we can prevail militarily. And so what does that leave us to do? It leaves us to do everything we can to try to outpace China in a long-term race. This is more of a marathon than a sprint. This is an issue where prestige will drive from performance. And performance will be measured largely by economic strength. Economic strength will be driven by innovation. Innovation will be done by highly talented individuals. And this is an area where the United States has an asymmetric advantage. China has the benefit of 1.4 billion people to draw from. So they've got that going for them. We historically have had the benefit of being able to draw the best and the brightest minds from around the world to want to live here, work here, and contribute here. And if we cultivate and nurture and protect that asset, I think that we'll do just fine in our ability to outpace and outcompete our foremost competitor being China. So just to briefly wrap up and turn it back to you, I think that China is facing some pretty significant headwinds. They have declining economic growth, worsening demographics, mounting debt, rising unemployment. They have a 20% youth unemployment rate in China right now. So 1 out of every 5 people between 16 and 24 doesn't have a job in China. Even so, they will grow in the ballpark of 3 to 4% this year if the IMF is accurate in its forecast. And that will contribute a sizable portion of the global economic growth this year. US-China trade will break new records this year. And at the end of the day, both leaders in Washington and Beijing are confronting some extraordinary challenges, both at home but also around the world, with food insecurity, energy insecurity, mounting debt, distress, climate change, mass migration. These are some extraordinary systemic challenges that the world confronts. So neither leader is going to want to be seen as bowing to pressure from the other, but I don't think either is going to want to find themselves in a fight with the other either. And so this is the zone we're in. This is the zone that we will be in for the next year. And I hope that this is enough to get the conversation started. I'm really eager to hear your thoughts, reflections, reactions. Thank you.
Talk a little bit about China's self-described wolf warrior foreign policy.
So the question is about China's wolf warrior foreign policy. Wolf warrior is the name of a movie in China that was glorifying these kick-ass commandos that went into Africa to destroy everything in their path, to protect Chinese citizens and bring them out of harm's way back to the motherland. It is become shorthand for a very aggressive form of diplomacy where Chinese diplomats depart from diplomatic niceties to stand up for the dignity and protect the reputation of the Chinese people. And they have alienated people in countries around the world, but they have done so because it serves them well in their own system. What people have been promoted for is being relentless, fearless defenders of the pride of the Chinese people and the Chinese nation. And the deputy spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is this person who was plucked out of obscurity because he was getting into Twitter fights with Susan Rice and other people as he was the political officer in a consulate in Pakistan. And now he has a global platform to speak to the international media on a daily basis. And others have watched this person who was a counterpart of mine in Washington, a decade ago, be parachuted up to this highly visible place and say, you know what, that worked pretty good for him. Maybe we should give it a try ourselves. And so now we have ambassadors around the world that are engaging in daily verbal sparring matches on social media, on mass media, in meetings to defend the honor of the Chinese people.
Thank you for your informative presentation earlier. A question, you had mentioned that the Chinese have just one military base worldwide. However, they have a tremendous number of Belt and Bridge systems around the world, including the Panama Canal, the enlarged Panama Canal. How does that play into power within those areas?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this Belt and Road Initiative is an initiative that began before Xi Jinping, but has been branded as sort of a project under Xi Jinping. And it is a project that has employed a few strengths that China has in projects overseas. So the Chinese realized that one of the biggest bottlenecks to human development is a shortage of infrastructure. The Chinese are pretty good at building roads and bridges and pipes and airports. They've done an extraordinary job of it at home. They also have a surplus of construction workers. As they have fewer projects, they've already built bridges to nowhere in China. They have no more bridges to build to nowhere. So they have a lot of workers that they need to employ. They don't want them just roaming around the cities with nothing to do. They also have a lot of capital. They have a closed capital account that they need to find productive uses for. Otherwise, it just stays parked in dollars and treasuries and creates vulnerabilities for them. And so they figured out that their supply and the world's demand could be met through this global project called the Belt and Road Initiative to build infrastructure projects. But it wasn't altruism. They've charged commercial rates for most all of these projects that they've built. And many of these countries are coming up against debt distress. Sri Lanka is the most obvious example, or the poster child of this, but Zambia and others are as well. Whereas as interest rates go up, the cost of covering this debt rise as well. And these projects that were supposed to be so great haven't produced as many benefits as I think were advertised. In part because the Chinese brought their own laborers, they brought their own know-how, and they charge commercial rates. And at the same time, when China's economy is growing 10%, it's a little easier to be magnanimous with building bridges around the world. When your economy is growing 3%, your population is aging, and they're demanding more social services, it gets a little harder to justify shoveling billions of dollars into building roads in Azerbaijan. And so I have seen a noticeable decrease in the amount of references that the Chinese leadership makes to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now they're promoting the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative, these new ideas, which are sort of banners without much substance underneath them, and they don't come with a lot of cost. So I think that we're seeing sort of an evolution out of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I expect that we will continue to in the coming years.
Thanks, Dr. Haas, for a great presentation. Thanks for coming a very long way, my hometown of DC. So it's great to hear your presentation this evening. My question is related to national debt levels, and I'm wondering who do you feel is in more danger of reaching some national debt level, percent of debt to GDP, that the economic power of the country starts waning, whereas the other one is still in a good spot?
These are really hard questions. I'd love to hear from Sam and others. So if anyone wants to jump in, please feel free. You're welcome to. I wrote a book last year called Stronger, and I won't try to sell you on my book, but the basic argument of it is that China has incredible strengths, but it also has incredible vulnerabilities. And if we only focus on their strengths, we inflate them up to these 10-foot-tall giants that can see over mountains and predict the future. And anyone who has spent time dealing with Chinese counterparts know that they're very impressive, diligent, hardworking people, but they are not 10 feet tall, and they cannot forecast the future or jump over mountains. I think that if I had to bet on a stock between the United States and China, I would bet long on the United States. Every day, if you take a snapshot of our country, it looks like a mess. If you take a sort of a video reel of our country, somehow, some way, we tend to find our way through and come out stronger after each of these challenges. China has had an incredible 45-year run, and I don't wish the Chinese any ill. I hope that they have success. I just hope that we continue to be successful as well, and if we play up to our potential, I'm quite confident in our capacity to compete with China.
We have a couple questions on this side of the room, and I'll bounce back and forth.
Apparently, the CCP has police stations throughout the world. Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, so there's been reports that have come out in recent weeks that have shown a spotlight on the fact that the Chinese have set up, without really much approval from any of the host governments, these stations which are being run by members of the Chinese police. And China has a desire to make it uncomfortable, I think, for people who have fled China, either because they've been involved in previous corruption or they're concerned for their health or safety. They don't want to make it easy for people to leave China with assets or secrets that the Chinese want to keep inside their country. And so I think that our investigative media is shining a spotlight on the fact that China is engaging in what they refer to as, I guess, long-arm policing of leaning on Chinese citizens in countries around the world. And I expect that as more attention is drawn to this, that there will be more scrutiny of these Chinese practices.
Next question's in the second.
So you hear that there's a lot of China going into Africa and making deals that are not really beneficial for the people. Does the U.S. get involved at any level in trying to discourage countries from making deals for aid or for whatever?
Well, there have been pilot projects by the United States. It's a really good question. There have been pilot projects by the United States to go in and, when we know in advance that the Chinese are pitching certain projects, to basically provide a template of what a best practice would look like, or to send our lawyers. We have a lot of lawyers in our country, right? Send some of our legal expertise to help sort of work through the contractual details and help ensure that countries who are recipients of these offers have a clear understanding of what it is that they're signing up for. And in at least one case, in the case of Myanmar a few years ago, it had effect. The leadership there took on board the advice that we had offered and negotiated terms that better favored them and provided less space for exploitation. The challenge I think that we have is that these countries do have genuine needs. A lot of these projects are demand driven by the recipient countries because they do need to build things or take care of services. And it's hard for the United States to beat something with nothing. And we have not been in the business of building infrastructure effectively for a while on a global scale.
Yeah, over here. Thank you. Just in terms of power, how do you feel that the distribution of resources and their ability to go in and actually, be pretty strategic in tying up a lot of the world's resources as we go into, climate change and more need for these minerals, and how does that stack up in terms of their power in the world?
Yeah, it's an important question because a lot of the electric vehicle batteries, semiconductor chips, specialized parts that go into long-range missiles require these rare earths elements in order to function. And for a long time, over 90% of the world's rare earths were produced in China, which created an extraordinary choke point or potential vulnerability if the Chinese, in a period of hostility, said, "Sorry, we're done. Good luck." The good news is that rare earths aren't that rare. They're everywhere. They're in West Virginia. They're in Texas. They're in Utah. They're just expensive and really climate insensitive to extract. And China threatened Japan in, I think it was 2011, when China and Japan had a bit of a tiff over disputed islands, to cut off rare earth exports to Japan because Japan has a high-tech industry and it would have been really damaging to their economic prospects. And they did a real favor to the world when they did that because it alerted all of us to the vulnerability that we also have, not just the Japanese. And in the last decade, I think we've probably made less progress at a slower speed than we need to reduce our dependency and vulnerability to China's rare earth monopolies. But we have begun to make progress. So with Australia, with European partners, in opening up alternate sources of supply. So, knock on wood, I think that we're going to get to a better spot. The sooner the better.
I wonder if you could talk about the China interest in Taiwan. Is it economic? Is it strategic? Is it national pride? Is it historic? What exactly is underlying this strong interest China has in Taiwan?
Well, I'm happy to offer perspective, but we have the Consul General from Taiwan here. I really would love for him to answer this question if you're comfortable doing so.
Okay, I think I answered a similar question last night in Denver, Council for International Affairs. So really, I represent Taiwan, I don't represent China. So I cannot speak on behalf of Xi Jinping, and his mind is so particular, so it's very hard to explore. But from a Taiwanese point of view, and people will say that, because Taiwan's, dominance in the semiconductor industry, for example, that's something China really wants. I would rather think that that is for at least for Xi Jinping himself, a more minor issue than this kind of grandiose sense of historical responsibility that really he needs to achieve something. Whether he wants to achieve it during his reign, that means until he dies. I really don't know. But you somehow find that whenever there is internal trouble, they try to find a scapegoat somewhere else. And in this case, Taiwan happens to an easy target. And another case is that if the Americans make them unhappy, they turn around and try to kick Taiwan around. So I do think, within Xi Jinping's mind, he has this sense, if he can get it, certainly he wants to be the great man of China, maybe right after Mao Zedong. But if he is sane and rational enough, perhaps he'll think twice. But the rhetoric will be there. And whenever there are internal troubles, and you're gonna see more after this power transition, because right now you don't have those reform-minded people sitting in the Politburo. All you have in the Politburo are actually, a clique of his lackeys. So you can anticipate more trouble domestically in China. In that sense, I think the rhetoric is more and more going to be there. Whether some kind of accident or incident is going to turn it into an all-out confrontation with Taiwan and eventually with the United States, really, I cannot tell, because there's no way I can speak on behalf of Xi Jinping, emotional and irrational as I am, I'm never at that level, So I can only say, as Taiwanese, we have to prepare for it. And as many of our American friends say, that we are really, the level of preparedness is really not there, So I think we need to speed up. And in fact, that is what the government and even the civil society of Taiwan is trying to do. You see this guy called Cao Xincheng. He was actually used to be the head of United Semiconductors, which used to be the #2 semiconductor company in Taiwan, but they lagged behind TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Company, over the last 2 decades. Unfortunately, when I was young, I tried to buy stocks at TSMC, but my wife strongly advised me to buy UMC.
Oh, no.
So I have to work, otherwise I'll be a rich man. But that being said, I'll have to say, it's all the elements combined that makes Taiwan so important to China. But if you really look at history, there have been only 4 years in the last maybe 200 years when mainland China and Taiwan were together. That's the years after World War II and before Chiang Kai-shek was defeated in mainland China and had to, relocate his government to Taiwan. So the Chinese claim of historical, China's historical claim of Taiwan is really without any real base, I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an education. And I certainly don't speak for Xi Jinping either, but I would just add to the wise words that my friend offered, that I think that the Chinese Communist Party, part of its founding myth is that it would be the party that united China together after a period in which China was fractured. That was what their argument was for why they needed to lead the country, in part. And they've brought Xinjiang under their fold, they've brought Tibet under their fold, they've brought Hong Kong under their fold. The missing jewel in the crown is Taiwan. And I think a lot of people in Washington are increasingly concerned that as Xi Jinping becomes more consolidated in his power and isolated from people who challenge it, that isolated emperor syndrome could set in, and that he may not act with the best knowledge or awareness of what the implications of his actions are, particularly as he gets closer to the end of his life, could feel a greater sense of destiny or greater tolerance for risk to try to complete the mission that the Chinese Communist Party set out to complete in 1949. So,
Thank you for the presentation. I'd like to ask you about the Korean Peninsula and anything with North Korea, and then potentially nuclear proliferation in that area.
Yeah, it's a really important question. North Korea is in the midst of an escalation cycle. They've tested more long-range missiles this year than any recent year. There's a lot of concern that they will test another nuclear device soon. And traditionally, when these things happen, the United States goes to China. The United States and China both recognize that neither of their interests are served by Kim Jong-un being reckless, creating problems on China's periphery. And we both try to work together to manage the situation. In the current context, that's just not an option that's available. The U.S.-China relationship is too broken to allow for any appearance of the United States and China working together to manage a problem, even one that is on China's physical doorstep. And when the United States went to the United Nations Security Council several weeks ago to say that North Korea had violated the UN Security Council resolutions through its long-range missile tests, the Chinese said, "We'll call you when we're done with our hair appointment." You've created so many problems for us, don't expect any help from us. And that's where we are right now, which is in a dangerous situation. And there's a certain risk that Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, is not liking the fact that he can't seem to manage to get his way back to the front page of the newspapers. Ukraine, climate change, food insecurity, he's competing with a lot of other significant global trends, and that he's going to continue to escalate his troublemaking until he gets our attention. And that's the risk that we're up against. The challenge that we have is that there just is no near-term solution. We don't have any mixture of incentives or deterrents available to us that could compel him to abandon his nuclear weapons program, because I think in his mind that would be tantamount to abandoning his control over his country, which is an existential risk for him that I don't think he's willing to contemplate at the moment.
Could you discuss the situation of the Uyghurs in Western China, how that fulfills some objective for the Chinese government and how it plays into the rest of the international developments that are going on?
Yeah, so this is a question about an ethnic minority, and predominantly but not exclusively in Xinjiang, in Western China, that has suffered extraordinary persecution. At one point, several years ago, it was estimated that over 1 million people were in involuntary detention, basically taken away, put in these re-education camps, and taught how to talk like a Chinese communist, think like a Chinese communist, act like a Chinese communist, and told that outward expressions of their religiosity were prohibited, and many of their cultural traditions were no longer allowed. And about a year ago, the person who was responsible for overseeing that policy was shifted to a different job. Last month, when they had the party congress, he was not promoted. In the year since, the person who is there has begun gradually to unwind some of the more egregious elements of this policy. But it's still, a catastrophically bad human rights situation. I was the reporting officer for Xinjiang when I worked in the embassy. And so I would travel to this region on a quarterly basis for 3 years, made friends, and it breaks my heart to see what has happened there. So I guess the trend line is cautiously positive, but it's still a pretty dark, dour situation.
China is graduating about 6 or 8 times as many engineers every year as the United States. Why won't they give them some advantage in innovation?
Yeah, so the question is, China is graduating massive numbers of engineers, and how will that affect their competitiveness and innovation? It will. I mean, it just, quantity has a quality of its own, and the fact that China is really the anchor for low-cost engineering talent around the world is a distinct advantage for them. But a lot of the high-end innovations are done by a couple hundred people in the world, and there is a qualitative edge that the United States has because, fortunately for us, at least in the current moment, most of those couple hundred people, particularly in artificial intelligence, live in the United States. And many of them were born and raised in China and came to the United States for graduate school and a PhD program and decided to stay here. And I hope that we find ways to continue to sustain that because it has done an enormous service to America's global economic competitiveness.
You mentioned that the vulnerabilities that China has, but really haven't spoken too much, and we should all buy your book, I think, to read and see exactly what the vulnerabilities are. But there's a lot of talk about the powers that China has and the advantages that it has. Can you mention 3 or 4 of what you see as China's vulnerabilities on the world stage? Is it things like food and energy and the fact that they're so interrelated in economies with not only we're dependent on China, they're dependent on us as well as economies around the world. So what do you see as top vulnerabilities of China?
Well, they're on a demographic path that resembles Japan's from 20 years ago. They have surging debt. They have flat productivity. They've sort of plucked all the low-hanging fruit, and they're really having a hard time increasing productivity. And, you know, I'm not an economist, but I've studied economics, and I know that there are 3 elements to an economy: people, capital, and productivity. Those are the 3 legs of the economic stool, and all 3 of those legs are weak. They have taken a statist turn in their economy. The best way to find a leading entrepreneurial thinker that is Chinese is to go to Singapore. Because it's just not a great place. Being a boundary-pushing thinker who wants to go out and do far-out innovative things is really hard to do in China right now. Because the Chinese leadership wants their talent focused on their priorities, not on things that are unrelated to what the state has defined as its priorities. And it's hard to find many instances in which you know, a country substitutes the role of the state for the wisdom of markets that have sustained growth for long periods of time. And so China has abundant strengths, but I think that they have some real vulnerabilities as well, some of them which are self-inflicted.
So will you talk a little bit about the energy dependencies between Russia, the United States, and China? I know we're exporting coal to them, and I don't know if they're a net exporter, importer, or they're moving toward cleaner energy sources or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think China, it's sort of a conundrum because on one hand, they are the world's leading producer of clean energy technologies by a large margin that has widened with time. On the other hand, they're the world's leading consumer of dirty fossil fuels. And so the amount of carbon output that China provides to the environment on a yearly basis eclipses every other country in the world by a significant margin, including us. China is still highly dependent upon external sources of supply for energy. Some of that comes from Russia, but there is a physical limit to how much the Chinese can import from Russia because it comes through pipelines, and there are only a finite number of pipelines. A lot of that energy supply comes from the Middle East. And next month, Xi Jinping will travel to Saudi Arabia, and he will be looking to secure the best terms he possibly can because he knows that China remains heavily dependent upon Middle Eastern fuel.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. My question is on Taiwan. How do you assess the Biden administration's Taiwan policy? He talked several times the U.S. will come to military defense of Taiwan. and that seems he gave up the strategic ambiguity. Then he come back said we still adhere to one China policy. So in that case, what is his one China policy? Has he abandoned the strategic ambiguity?
Who let this
or
rigor in here?
should the U.S. abandon that, as Rich Hars talked about?
Well, look, there was a poll done by Foreign Affairs that was published yesterday. And the poll asked a group of experts across the country, basically the question that Dr. Zhao asked, should the United States have strategic clarity? Should it declare that it will come to Taiwan's defense militarily? Consequences be damned. And the results were somewhat counterintuitive. Among experts, the answer was mostly no, we should not do that. Now, what Dr. Zhao is being a troublemaker and asking about is the fact that President Biden has said publicly 4 times that the United States will come to Taiwan's defense if Taiwan is attacked. And this is not consistent with longstanding policy. But President Biden is the President of the United States. He gets to set policy, right? And in my experience, having worked with presidents, when they say something 4 times, they usually mean it. And so I think that he means what he says. And that's how I would interpret it. At the same time, if we were going to be charitable, acknowledging that he has been rhetorically imprecise in the way that he talks about an issue where words matter more than just about any other issue in the world, I think what he's trying to do is to say that America's interest is in preserving the equilibrium of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And in the past, when we've been concerned about Taiwan taking actions that could trigger a conflict, we have been pretty aggressive at putting pressure on Taiwan to step back, to pull back. And now our concern is that China could take actions that will trigger a conflict, and that's where the focus of our efforts, our energy, and our rhetoric is aimed.
Question over here. I'd like to ask you a different question than the one I told you at dinner that I was going to ask. I'm wondering, put yourself in Xi Jinping's position. Do you think it occurs to him that his aggressive policies, whether they're military, whether they're economic, vis-a-vis South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, etc., is almost inevitably going to drive particularly Korea and Japan, and maybe even Taiwan, to developing nuclear weapons to protect themselves? Can they really believe that the United States will launch nuclear weapons? But it seems to me almost inevitable that to protect themselves from a very aggressive leader in China, that they are almost certainly going to think very seriously, and I think probably rationally, about developing nuclear weapons for their own defense.
It's a very hard question. It's a dangerous question. Yeah, it's one of the most dangerous questions there is. You know, the United States has blocked Taiwan and Korea, and less so Japan, but Taiwan and Korea's path to nuclear weapons in the past. We've actively intervened to stop that from happening. And on one hand, my view is that if one of those 3 gets nuclear weapons, all 3 of them will get nuclear weapons, because Korea will not allow Japan to have nuclear weapons without itself having nuclear weapons, and vice versa. And if Korea and Japan have nuclear weapons, then Taiwan, I think, will feel pretty vulnerable itself and will want to join the club. I think that Xi Jinping has 2 calculations to this question. The first is faith that the United States will see this as an extraordinarily dangerous enterprise and will rein in its friends from going down this path because the consequences could be catastrophic. And the second is a belief that economic determinism will drive the day, that China's economy is becoming more and more central to the global economy, its role in Asian value chains is becoming more and more central, and that these countries can't afford not to have a workable relationship with China, and that desire for a workable relationship with China will compel them to have some self-restraint. Time will tell whether or not those calculations are accurate, but if I had to put myself in Xi Jinping's shoes, I think that's the the logic that would guide my thinking.
You've talked about the Communist Party, the leadership, the government of China. What about the people in China? You still have a large rural population, and then you have hundreds of millions in major cities. What are the, for lack of a better term, the common people thinking, and do they support what is taking place? I mean, they live under certainly a thumb of the regime that is there.
Yeah, I mean, I will offer a perspective. I'm sure others in the room can as well, and I welcome Sam or others to do so. But I have to caveat this by saying that I haven't been in China in a year and a half because of COVID. So it's possible that my views are outdated. But my impression from watching this for a living is that when Xi Jinping became president in 2012, he was seen as a princeling, as the son of a former senior Chinese official, and that was his base of support, and those were her supporters. Now, if you look at Xi Jinping, he basically, on a monthly basis, travels to the equivalent of Mississippi, West Virginia, and rural Arkansas. And he has pictures that are plastered on the front pages of the newspapers and on the nightly news program on TV of him, sitting around fires, eating dumplings with people that may or may not have shoes. Why is he doing this? He's doing it because he wants public support to be a shield against elite discontent. Because he's gone after, on anti-corruption and other measures, a lot of these princeling families. And his shield against the animosity that they may feel is to be so broadly popular that it would be inconceivable for anyone to ever contemplate taking him out. And so what that tells me, if that thesis is accurate, is that he thinks that he has pretty broad support amongst the common people, the Labaixing. And I don't have any reason to challenge that. I think the biggest threat that he faces is not from common people outside of major cities, it's from the elites who are pissed off that the world that they knew, where they could travel freely around the world, send their kids to fancy educations in the West, tech entrepreneurs who could launch new startups, that world is leaving them. And what is left is a more sort of tightly concentrated power around Xi Jinping.
Just to follow up to that point, we keep hearing about how angry people are about the lockdown with COVID, and that they can't earn a living and they can't go to work. And is that having any effect on his popularity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that I don't think that the zero COVID policy is a applause line in China right now. And the numbers are just extraordinary. On any given day, there's basically the equivalent of the American population that is in some form of lockdown inside China for COVID-related issues. It's coming at an enormous economic expense to China. Obviously, it's dampened consumption and lowered economic growth. It's created, social turmoil. And so why? Why do they keep on doing this, right? That's the question. And I think that there are a few reasons. The first is that they don't have a mRNA vaccine of their own, and they're too proud to import foreign vaccines. They've built a narrative that China's mode of dealing with COVID is superior to the West, that unlike those barbaric Americans who allow 1 million of their citizens to die, Xi Jinping cares so much about his people that he will suffer the consequences of lower economic growth to keep people safe. He will suffer the consequences of unpopularity to protect the people he loves. And they also don't have the hospital capacity to deal with surges of cases. They don't have the same, medical facilities that we do here to deal with surges of cases. And if they were to open up quickly, and if there was a surge of cases that led to deaths, what would that say about the narrative of Xi Jinping and his love for his people? So they're stuck in a trap of their own making on this.
Back to Ukraine. You mentioned the personal relationship between, the leaders of both China and Russia. In a scenario where Russia starts to truly get pushed out of Ukraine, would you envision that China might be embarrassed to the point of wanting to openly provide and aggressively provide arms to Russia to try to turn the tide?
I don't know. I wish I knew, but my guess is no. My guess is that the Chinese don't actually care that much about the outcome of the Ukraine war. They care about whether Putin stays in power and Russia stays aligned with China. And, you know, I mean, the Chinese see opportunity in Ukraine as well. Ukraine's going to need to be rebuilt, and who's going to rebuild Ukraine? China. And so I don't think that they would want to write off that opportunity and expose themselves to the sanctions and other forms of pressure that they would attract by providing arms to Russia.
China is sitting on a demographic time bomb, probably second only to Japan, with an aging population. They felt with the one-child policy that they could turn off and turn on productivity. They lifted the one-child policy, and it had very little effect on fecundity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you watch carefully at the Beijing Olympics, the opening and closing ceremonies, very much they were glorifying children, trying to encourage the Chinese people to have more children. What's going to happen? How are they going to manage that?
Well, the Chinese have been encouraging their people to have children for recent years, and it hasn't worked, as Joe suggested. It hasn't worked because it's really expensive, it's really tough for families to have children, to raise them in China. It's a similar challenge to what Japanese families face in Japan. And so I think that the Chinese, I think they got it wrong. I think that they assumed that once they lifted the one-child policy that there would be a flowering of productivity or of fertility, and it just hasn't happened. I don't think it's going to. I think that the Chinese demographic slope is going to continue into the middle of the century and beyond.
We have some of our own problem along that way too, maybe a little bit behind. Number one, in 2017, the United Nations passed the TPNW, the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Is there any conversation at all pertaining to that? And I'm aware we have a lot of hawks in the U.S. that feel that the only way to beat China is with a bigger club. When will we realize that peaceful means can be a lot more powerful, longer lasting than a great big club?
Well, those are really good questions. I think that on nuclear weapons, I think China's moving in the opposite direction. They feel like they need to have upwards of 1,000 or more nuclear weapons. And I think the reason why they want to have nuclear weapons is that when they have assured second strike capability against the United States, it freezes our nuclear advantage, takes nuclear weapons off the table, and turns this into a conventional fight. And if it's a conventional fight, they're fighting 80 miles off their shore, we're fighting 5,000 miles from ours. They have some geographic advantages, right? On the harder question about when will the United States realize that it can't fight its way to victory with China, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. But I do think that we're 5 or 6 years into running an experiment of sort of trying to pursue a very hawkish, muscular approach to get the Chinese to back down, and they haven't. And it's come at a cost, a pretty considerable cost of our ability to deal with some of the problems that we have on climate issues and other issues. I think the best predictor of when we may sort of break the fever on the current approach is if and when the political pendulum swings back to more of the center of the political spectrum in the United States. If it does so, I think that China as an issue will become less politicized. And if China as an issue is less politicized, that creates more space for policymakers to manage the relationship. In a faraway time when I worked at the White House in the second term of the Obama administration, the advice that I was given on my first day on the job was, I worked in the National Security Council staff as the China director. And what I was told on my first day was focus on the policy, not the politics. If you get the policy right, there will be good results. Good results will create good politics. Now it's the inverse. Now it's don't screw up the politics, because if you do, then everything will be screwed up. And as long as the politics are driving decisions on China policy, we're going to be in sort of a weird spot, I think.
Do we have any other questions? Well, then, thank you, and help me in thanking Ryan Haas for this very informative presentation.